The rain came down like bullets that Tuesday night. Dr. Lisa Chen gripped her steering wheel tighter as the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the storm. It was almost 2 in the morning, and the streets were empty except for the occasional streetlight cutting through the darkness. She had just finished a brutal 14-hour shift at Mercy General Hospital. 3 car accident victims, 2 heart attacks, and 1 kid who had fallen off his bike and broken his arm. Her scrubs still smelled like antiseptic, and her feet ached in her worn sneakers. All she wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. The storm had come out of nowhere. The weather report said light rain, but this was something else entirely. Water rushed down the gutters like rivers, and the wind made her small Honda shake every few seconds. Lisa squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the road ahead. That's when she saw him. At first, it was just a shadow on the bench at the old bus stop near 5th Street. But as her headlights swept across the area, she could see it was a person, an older man, maybe in his 70s, sitting completely still as the rain poured down on him. He wasn't even trying to cover himself. Lisa's first instinct was to keep driving. It was late, she was tired, and picking up strangers wasn't exactly the smartest thing to do. But something made her slow down. Maybe it was her training as a doctor, or maybe it was just basic human decency. Either way, she couldn't just leave someone sitting in this weather. She pulled over about 20 feet past the bus stop and sat there for a moment, engine running. Through her rearview mirror, she could see the man hadn't moved. He was hunched over, his shoulders shaking. Whether from cold or something else, she couldn't tell. "Come on, Lisa," she whispered to herself. "You know you can't just drive away." She grabbed her medical bag from the passenger seat. It was something she always kept in her car. Basic supplies for emergencies. Living in the city, you never knew when you might need them. She also pulled out the emergency blanket from her trunk, the kind they used in the ambulances. The rain hit her like a wall the moment she stepped out of the car. Within seconds, her hair was plastered to her head and her clothes were soaked through. She ran toward the bus stop, her sneakers splashing through puddles that seemed to appear out of nowhere. "Sir, are you okay?" she called out as she got closer. The man looked up at her and her heart sank. His face was pale, almost gray, and his lips had a bluish tint that she recognized immediately. His clothes were completely soaked and he was shivering so hard he could barely speak. I'm fine," he managed to say, but his voice was weak and shaky. Just waiting for the bus, Lisa looked around. There was no bus schedule posted, and she was pretty sure no buses ran this route after midnight. But that wasn't her biggest concern right now. This man was showing clear signs of hypothermia, and if she didn't do something fast, he could be in real trouble. "The buses aren't running right now," she said gently, kneeling down next to him. "I'm a doctor. What's your name?" He hesitated for a moment, as if he wasn't sure he should tell her. "Frank," he finally said. "Frank Rodriguez. Okay, Frank, I'm Lisa. I need to get you out of this rain right now." "You're very cold and that's dangerous." Frank tried to wave her off. No, I don't want to be any trouble. I'll be fine," but Lisa could see he was anything but fine. His skin was cold and clammy when she touched his wrist to check his pulse. His heart rate was slow and he seemed confused, which were both bad signs. "Frank, listen to me," she said, wrapping the emergency blanket around his shoulders. "You're not being any trouble, but I need to get you somewhere warm right now. My car is right there. Will you let me help you?" For a moment, Frank just stared at her. Rain was dripping from his gray hair and his dark eyes seemed to be studying her face. Lisa wondered what he was thinking. Was he trying to decide if he could trust her? Did he think she was some kind of threat? "Why would you want to help me?" he asked quietly. The question caught Lisa off guard. Why wouldn't she help him? He was a human being who needed help. That should be reason enough. "Because you need help," she said simply. "And I'm a doctor. It's what I do." Frank was quiet for another moment, then slowly nodded. Okay. Getting him to the car wasn't easy. Frank's legs were unsteady, and he had to lean on Lisa for support. She was grateful for all those years of lifting patients in the hospital. Even though Frank was a big man, probably 6 feet tall, she managed to guide him to her car without either of them falling. Once they were both inside, Lisa immediately turned the heat up as high as it would go. She kept the emergency blanket wrapped around Frank and reached into her medical bag for a thermometer. "I need to check your temperature," she explained, but Frank was already opening his mouth without being asked. The reading made her frown. 94.8 degrees. Definitely hypothermic, but not critical yet. Frank, how long were you sitting out there? She asked as she started driving. I don't know, he said, his voice still shaky. A while, I guess. I missed my bus. Lisa glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Something about his story didn't quite add up, but now wasn't the time to ask questions. Right now she needed to get him warmed up and make sure he was okay. Are you hurt anywhere? Any pain? She asked. Frank shook his head. Just cold. Lisa drove slowly through the storm, thinking about where to take him. The hospital was an option, but Frank didn't seem sick enough to need the emergency room. What he needed was warmth, dry clothes, and probably some hot food. She remembered the all-night diner on Maple Street. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and they served decent coffee. More importantly, the owner, Mrs. Peterson, was known for being kind to people who were down on their luck. I'm going to take you to get some coffee and food, she told Frank. You need to warm up from the inside out. Frank didn't argue, which worried her a little. In her experience, people usually had more fight in them, unless they were really not feeling well. As they drove through the empty streets, Lisa found herself wondering about Frank's story. He was well-spoken, polite, and something about the way he carried himself suggested he wasn't used to being homeless. But then again, you never really knew someone's story just by looking at them. The important thing was that he was safe now. The rest could wait until morning. The diner's neon sign flickered through the rain as Lisa pulled into the parking lot. Peterson's all-night cafe had been serving truckers, night shift workers, and insomniacs for over 30 years. The windows glowed warm yellow against the dark storm, and Lisa felt relieved to see it was still open. Frank had stopped shivering as much during the drive, which was a good sign. The car's heater had done its job, but Lisa knew he still needed to get completely warm and dry. She also wanted to get some hot food into him and observe him for a while to make sure he didn't have any other medical issues. How are you feeling? She asked as she turned off the engine. Better, Frank said, though his voice was still quiet. Thank you for this. I know you didn't have to stop. Lisa looked at him in the rearview mirror. Even in the dim light, she could see that some color had returned to his face. Of course I had to stop. Anyone would have done the same thing. Frank gave her a look that suggested he didn't entirely agree with that. But he didn't argue. The rain was still coming down hard as they made their way to the diner entrance. Lisa kept close to Frank, ready to steady him if he stumbled, but he seemed to be walking more normally now. The warmth of the car had helped, but she knew it would take time for his body to fully recover from being so cold. A bell chimed as they pushed through the door, and the smell of coffee and bacon hit them immediately. The diner was mostly empty except for a truck driver at the counter and an older woman reading a newspaper in a corner booth. Mrs. Peterson, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair, looked up from behind the counter. Well, hello there, Dr. Chen, she said with a smile. Working late again? Lisa had been coming to this diner for years, usually after particularly long shifts when she was too tired to cook. Mrs. Peterson always remembered her customers and had a way of making everyone feel welcome. Something like that, Lisa said. Mrs. Peterson, this is Frank. We got caught in the storm, and I was hoping we could warm up here for a bit. Mrs. Peterson took one look at Frank's wet clothes and pale face and immediately understood the situation. Of course, honey. You two sit wherever you like. I'll get you some hot coffee right away. They chose a booth near the heater and Lisa helped Frank out of his wet jacket. Underneath, his shirt was still damp, but at least it wasn't soaking wet. She noticed that his clothes, while wet and wrinkled, were good quality. His shoes were leather, well made but worn from walking. You must think I'm crazy, Frank said as they settled into the booth. Sitting out in the rain like that? Lisa shook her head. I don't think you're crazy at all. Sometimes life puts us in situations we never expected. Mrs. Peterson appeared with 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a small plate of sugar cookies. On the house, she said with a wink. You both look like you could use it. Frank wrapped his hands around the mug and took a sip. Lisa watched as he closed his eyes for a moment, seeming to savor the warmth. She found herself curious about his story, but she also knew better than to push. People would share what they wanted to share when they were ready. So what kind of doctor are you? Frank asked after a few minutes. Emergency medicine, Lisa said. I work at Mercy General downtown. Nights like this keep me busy. People slip on wet sidewalks, car accidents from the rain, that sort of thing. Frank nodded thoughtfully. That must be challenging work, dealing with emergencies all the time. It is, but I love it. There's something about being able to help people in their worst moments that makes all the difficult parts worth it. She noticed Frank studying her face as she talked. There was something about his expression that seemed familiar, though she couldn't place it. He had the kind of eyes that suggested he'd seen a lot in his life. "Have you been in the city long?" Lisa asked. Frank hesitated a while. "I'm sort of between places right now." It was a careful answer that didn't really tell her much, but Lisa respected his privacy. She'd worked in the ER long enough to know that everyone had their reasons for keeping certain things to themselves. Mrs. Peterson returned to take their food order. Frank insisted he wasn't hungry, but Lisa ordered him a bowl of chicken soup anyway. "Trust me," she told him. "You need something warm in your stomach." While they waited for the food, Lisa kept an eye on Frank's condition. His color was much better now, and he'd stopped shivering completely. But there was something else she noticed. The way he held himself. The way he spoke. Despite his circumstances, there was a dignity about him that suggested he wasn't used to being in this situation. "Can I ask you something?" Frank said suddenly. "Sure. Why did you become a doctor? Was it always something you wanted to do?" Lisa smiled. It wasn't the question she'd expected. "My grandmother. She got sick when I was 12, and I spent a lot of time at the hospital with her. I watched how the doctors and nurses took care of not just her medical needs, but how they made her feel less scared. I knew then that I wanted to be able to do that for other people." Frank nodded slowly. "That's a good reason. The best doctors are the ones who remember that they're treating people, not just medical conditions." There was something about the way he said it that caught Lisa's attention. It sounded like the kind of thing someone with medical experience might say, but she didn't want to assume anything. The soup arrived, and Lisa was pleased to see Frank eat it without any more protests. As he ate, some of his strength seemed to return. He sat up straighter and his voice became clearer. "I need to ask you something," Lisa said after he'd finished most of the soup. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight? Somewhere safe and warm?" Frank looked uncomfortable. "I'll figure something out. There's a shelter about 10 blocks from here. They might still have space." Lisa frowned. The idea of Frank walking 10 blocks in this weather, especially after what he'd just been through, didn't sit well with her. But she also knew that her options were limited. She couldn't take him home. That wouldn't be safe for either of them. And the hospital wouldn't admit someone who wasn't actually sick. Then she had an idea. "What if you stayed at the hospital tonight?" she said. "There's a family waiting room that's open all night. It's warm and safe and security knows me. You could rest there until morning and then figure out your next step when the weather clears." Frank looked surprised. "You would do that? But wouldn't you get in trouble?" Lisa considered this. Technically, the waiting room was for families of patients, not homeless people seeking shelter. But it was late. The waiting room would probably be empty and the security guards had always been reasonable with her. "Let me worry about that," she said. "The important thing is making sure you're safe tonight." Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You've already done so much. You don't need to thank me," Lisa said. "Just promise me you'll stay warm and dry tonight." Frank nodded. "I promise." As they prepared to leave the diner, Lisa found herself thinking about how strange the night had been. A few hours ago, she'd been focused on nothing but getting home and going to sleep. Now she was arranging shelter for a man she'd just met. Life had a funny way of changing direction when you least expected it. But looking at Frank as he carefully put on his still damp jacket, Lisa knew she'd made the right choice. Sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply show up for another human being when they needed it most. 3 weeks had passed since that stormy night, and Lisa found herself looking forward to her Thursday volunteer shifts at the hospital's free clinic more than ever before. It wasn't just because she loved helping people who couldn't afford medical care, though that was certainly part of it. It was because Frank had started showing up. The first time she saw him in the clinic's waiting room, Lisa almost didn't recognize him. He was clean, his hair was combed, and he wore different clothes, still simple but neat and pressed. He was sitting patiently with a small stack of papers in his lap, watching the controlled chaos of the busy clinic with interest. "Frank?" she had called out, surprised. "What are you doing here?" He had smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did that night, and I thought maybe I could help out somehow." That was how it started. Frank began coming to the clinic every week, Not as a patient, but as a volunteer. At first, he just helped with small things, directing people to the right areas, helping elderly patients fill out forms, holding babies while their mothers checked in. But Lisa quickly noticed that Frank had a gift for making people feel comfortable. "He's amazing with the scared kids," said Dr. Williams, the clinic director, one Thursday afternoon. "Yesterday we had a 5-year-old who was terrified of getting his shots. Frank sat with him for 20 minutes telling him stories about brave knights, and by the end the kid was actually excited about being brave enough to get his vaccination." Lisa wasn't surprised. She'd watched Frank work with patients over the past few weeks, and there was something special about the way he connected with people. He had infinite patience, a gentle sense of humor, and most importantly, he seemed to genuinely care about everyone who walked through the clinic doors. What did surprise her, though, was Frank's knowledge of medical procedures. It started with small things that she might have overlooked if she hadn't been paying attention. When Mrs. Garcia came in speaking only Spanish, Frank immediately stepped in to translate. Not just the words, but the medical terminology in a way that showed he understood what the doctor was really asking. "How do you know Spanish?" Lisa had asked him later. "I've picked up a lot of languages over the years," Frank had said with a shrug. "You meet all kinds of people in this city." But it wasn't just the language skills. Lisa noticed that when parents brought in sick children, Frank seemed to instinctively know which symptoms were serious and which weren't. He would quietly suggest that certain patients be seen more quickly, and he was always right. When old Mr. Patterson came in complaining of chest pain, Frank had immediately flagged Lisa down, even though Mr. Patterson was insisting it was just heartburn. Something about his color wasn't right. Frank explained after they'd sent Mr. Patterson to the emergency room, where he was diagnosed with a mild heart attack, and the way he was holding his left arm. Lisa studied Frank's face. "That's exactly what I would have noticed. Do you have medical training?" Frank had looked uncomfortable at the question. "I've been around hospitals a lot. You pick things up." It was another of his non-answers, but Lisa was starting to recognize the pattern. Frank was clearly intelligent and well-educated, but he seemed determined to keep his background mysterious. She found herself increasingly curious about his story, but she also respected his privacy. The real turning point came on a particularly busy Thursday in late October. The clinic was packed with people dealing with flu symptoms, and they were short-staffed because 2 of their regular nurses had called in sick. Lisa was juggling 3 different patients when she heard a commotion from the waiting room. A woman was crying and speaking rapidly in Spanish while holding a toddler who was clearly having trouble breathing. The child's lips had a bluish tint, and he was making a high-pitched wheezing sound with each breath. Lisa rushed over, but before she could assess the situation, Frank was already there. He was speaking calmly to the mother in fluent Spanish while gently examining the little boy. "He's having an allergic reaction," Frank told Lisa without looking up. "Probably to something he ate. His airway is starting to close. We need epinephrine now, and we need to get him to the ER immediately." Lisa stared at him for a moment. Frank wasn't just making an educated guess, he was giving her a professional medical assessment. And he was absolutely right. The child was showing classic signs of anaphylaxis. "Call 911, she told the receptionist, then turned back to Frank. "Help me get him to the back room." Working together, they managed to administer the epinephrine and stabilize the child until the paramedics arrived. Frank stayed with the mother the entire time, explaining what was happening and keeping her calm while Lisa worked on her son. After the ambulance left and the crisis was over, Lisa found Frank in the hallway sitting quietly on a bench with his head in his hands. "That was incredible," she said, sitting down next to him. "You probably saved that little boy's life." Frank looked up at her and she could see he was shaken. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Lisa said firmly. "What you did was make a professional medical diagnosis in about 30 seconds. Frank, who are you really?" For a long moment, Frank didn't answer. He sat there looking at his hands, and Lisa could see him wrestling with something internal. "I used to be a doctor," he finally said quietly. "A long time ago." The admission hung in the air between them. Lisa felt like pieces of a puzzle were finally starting to fit together, but she still had so many questions. "What kind of doctor?" she asked gently. "Cardiothoracic surgery. I spent 43 years cutting people open and putting their hearts back together." Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. "I was good at it. Really good. What happened?" Lisa asked, though she wasn't sure she should. Frank was quiet for so long that Lisa thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was full of pain. My wife died 2 years ago. Cancer. I spent so many years saving other people's lives, but I couldn't save hers. He paused, wiping his eyes. After the funeral, I couldn't go back to the operating room. I couldn't pretend that what I did mattered anymore. Lisa felt her heart break for him. She'd seen doctors burn out before, but this was something deeper. This was a man who had lost not just his wife, but his sense of purpose. So you gave up medicine? She asked. I retired, sold my practice. I thought maybe if I got away from all of it, the pain would stop. Frank looked at her with sad eyes. But it didn't, and then I realized I had no idea who I was if I wasn't a surgeon. For 43 years, that's all I was. Dr. Frank Rodriguez, the heart surgeon. Without that, I was nobody. That's not true, Lisa said firmly. Look at what you've been doing here. Look at how you helped that little boy today. You're still saving lives, Frank. Maybe not in an operating room, but you're still making a difference. Frank shook his head. It's not the same. Maybe it doesn't have to be the same, Lisa said. Maybe it just has to matter. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the organized chaos of the clinic continue around them. Lisa thought about all the patients Frank had helped over the past few weeks, all the scared children he'd comforted, all the families he'd guided through difficult moments. Will you keep coming back? She asked finally. Frank looked at her, and for the first time in weeks she saw something like hope in his eyes. If you'll have me, he said. We need you here, Lisa said. And she meant it. These people need you. As they walked back toward the main clinic area, Lisa realized that Frank had been finding his way back to himself all along. He just needed someone to help him see it. The morning of November 15th started like any other for Lisa. She grabbed her coffee, checked her schedule, and headed to Mercy General for what she thought would be a routine day. But as soon as she walked through the hospital's main entrance, she knew something big was happening. The lobby was buzzing with activity. Staff members were clustered in small groups, whispering excitedly. Maintenance workers were hanging up decorations, and someone had set up a small stage near the information desk. Lisa spotted her colleague, Dr. Martinez, and hurried over to him. What's all this about? She asked, gesturing at the decorations. Dr. Martinez grinned. You haven't heard? Today's the big announcement about the new wing. The hospital board is finally revealing who made that massive donation we've been hearing rumors about for months. Lisa raised her eyebrows. She'd heard whispers about a mysterious benefactor who had supposedly donated enough money to build an entire new section of the hospital, but she'd assumed it was just hospital gossip. How much money are we talking about? $15 million, Dr. Martinez said, his voice full of amazement. Can you believe it? $15 million, completely anonymous, with only one condition, that the money be used to expand the free clinic and create a new community outreach program. Lisa felt her heart skip a beat. The free clinic where she volunteered, where Frank had been helping for the past month. Did they say anything else about the donor? Just that it was someone local who wanted to give back to the community. The board has been trying to convince them to go public for months, and apparently they finally agreed to make an appearance today. Lisa spent the rest of the morning distracted, thinking about the announcement. $15 million was an incredible amount of money. Whoever had donated it must be extremely wealthy. But the fact that they specifically wanted to help the free clinic made her think they understood what that place meant to the community. By noon, the lobby was packed. Hospital staff, board members, local news crews, and what looked like half the city had shown up for the announcement. Lisa found herself swept along with the crowd, curious despite herself about who could afford to give away so much money. Dr. Thompson, the hospital's chief administrator, stepped up to the microphone on the small stage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. 6 months ago, Mercy General received the largest single donation in our hospital's history. This generous gift will allow us to build a new wing dedicated entirely to community health services, including an expanded free clinic that will serve 3 times as many patients as we currently do. The crowd applauded, and Lisa found herself clapping along, though her mind was racing. She thought about all the patients they had to turn away from the clinic because they simply didn't have enough space or resources. This donation would change everything. The donor asked to remain anonymous, Dr. Thompson continued, but recently agreed to come forward because they wanted to personally explain their vision for how this money should be used. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Francisco Rodriguez. Lisa's world stopped. The name hit her like a physical blow. Francisco Rodriguez. Frank Rodriguez. It couldn't be the same person, could it? But then she saw him walking up to the stage and there was no doubt. It was Frank. Her Frank, the man she'd found shivering in the rain. The man who'd been volunteering at the clinic. The man who translated for Spanish-speaking patients and told stories to scared children. Except this wasn't the Frank she knew. This Frank was wearing an expensive dark suit that fit him perfectly. His hair was professionally styled, and he moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge. But it was definitely him, the same kind eyes, the same gentle smile. Lisa felt dizzy. She grabbed on to the person next to her for support, trying to process what she was seeing. Frank, Dr. Francisco Rodriguez, stepped up to the microphone and looked out at the crowd. His eyes found Lisa's in the sea of faces, and for a moment he paused. She could see something that looked like apology in his expression. "Thank you," he began, his voice carrying easily through the lobby. 6 months ago, I was going through the darkest period of my life. I had recently lost my wife of 45 years, and I was struggling to find meaning in anything. I had spent my entire career as a heart surgeon, but I felt like my heart had stopped working. The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. I decided to take some time away from my old life to figure out who I was without my wife, without my practice, without all the things that had defined me for so long. I spent weeks walking through the city, observing how people lived, how they struggled, how they helped each other. Lisa's hands were shaking. She thought about that night in the rain, about finding Frank on the bus stop bench. Had he been out there on purpose? Had it all been some kind of test? One night, during a terrible storm, I found myself at a bus stop with nowhere to go. I was cold, wet, and honestly, I didn't much care what happened to me. But then something amazing occurred. A young doctor, who had just finished a long shift at this very hospital, stopped her car and insisted on helping a complete stranger. Frank's eyes found Lisa's again, and this time he smiled. She didn't know who I was. She had no reason to help me except basic human kindness. She took me to safety, fed me, and even arranged for me to have a warm place to sleep. But more than that, she reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place, to help people who need it most. Lisa felt tears streaming down her face. Around her, people were turning to look at each other, murmuring about this incredible story. That doctor's name is Dr. Lisa Chen, and she's here with us today. Frank continued. Over the past month, I've had the privilege of volunteering alongside her at our free clinic. I've watched her treat every patient with dignity and respect, regardless of their ability to pay. I've seen her work extra shifts without complaint and give her own money to help families who couldn't afford their medications. The crowd turned to look for Lisa, and she felt herself blushing furiously. She wanted to disappear, but she couldn't look away from Frank. Dr. Chen probably thinks I'm a retired surgeon who lost his way, Frank said with a gentle laugh. What she doesn't know is that I spent the last 40 years building one of the most successful cardiac surgery practices in the state. When I sold my practice earlier this year, I realized I had more money than I could ever spend, but I didn't know how to use it in a way that would honor my wife's memory. Frank paused, wiping his eyes. My wife, Maria, always said that the best doctors were the ones who remembered that medicine was about serving people, not making money. Watching Dr. Chen work, seeing her compassion and dedication, I knew exactly what Maria would want me to do with this money. Lisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. Frank, this man she'd been worried about, this man she'd thought was homeless and lost, was one of the most successful doctors in the city, and he was giving away $15 million because of something she had done. This new wing will be called the Maria Rodriguez Center for Community Health, Frank announced. And I'm honored to announce that Dr. Lisa Chen has agreed to serve as its director. The crowd erupted in applause, but Lisa barely heard it. Frank had just offered her the job of a lifetime, running a state-of-the-art facility that could help thousands of people. But more than that, he had shown her that a simple act of kindness could have consequences she never could have imagined. As the crowd began to disperse and reporters rushed to interview Frank, Lisa stood frozen in place, trying to understand how her world had just completely changed. Lisa stood in the hospital lobby long after most of the crowd had left, watching Frank shake hands with reporters and board members. Her mind was spinning with questions, emotions, and a strange sense of unreality. The man she'd rescued from a bus stop in the rain was actually Dr. Francisco Rodriguez, one of the most respected heart surgeons in the country. Finally, after what felt like hours, Frank excused himself from the last group of reporters and walked over to where Lisa was standing. Up close, even in his expensive suit, she could still see the same gentle man who had volunteered at the clinic, who had comforted scared children and helped translate for worried parents. "I think we need to talk," he said quietly. They walked to the hospital's small garden, a peaceful area with benches surrounded by trees and flowers. It was Frank's suggestion. He said he needed fresh air after being inside with all those people for so long. Lisa was grateful for the privacy. She had so many questions she didn't know where to start. "So," she said as they sat down on a bench overlooking a small fountain, "Dr. Francisco Rodriguez, $15 million. I have to admit I didn't see that coming." Frank laughed, and it was the same warm laugh she'd grown accustomed to over the past month. "I know how it must look, like I was lying to you this whole time." "Were you?" Lisa asked, not accusingly, but because she genuinely wanted to understand. Frank was quiet for a moment, watching the water in the fountain. "Not exactly lying. Everything I told you about my wife, about losing my sense of purpose, about not knowing who I was anymore, all of that was true. I just left out some details about my bank account." Lisa shook her head, still trying to process everything. "But why? Why didn't you tell me who you were that first night? Or any night after that?" "Because that night in the rain, you didn't help me because of who I was or what I had," Frank said, turning to look at her. "You helped me because I was a human being who needed help. Do you know how rare that is?" Lisa frowned. "I don't think it's that rare. Most people would have stopped." "No, Lisa, they wouldn't have," Frank said gently. "I spent 2 months walking through this city before that night. I looked like exactly what I was, a lost, broken old man. I sat on park benches, I stood in line at soup kitchens, I slept in shelters. And you know what I learned? Most people look right through people like that. They cross the street, they avoid eye contact, they pretend not to see." Lisa thought about this. She'd seen it herself in the emergency room. The way some people treated homeless patients differently. With less patience, less respect. "That night," Frank continued, "you didn't ask me for my insurance card or my last name. You didn't want to know my story before you decided I was worth helping. You just saw someone who needed help and you helped. It reminded me of why I became a doctor in the first place." "But Frank," Lisa said, "you could have told me later, after we got to know each other at the clinic. I kept asking you questions about your background and you kept avoiding them." Frank smiled sadly. "Because I was afraid that if you knew the truth, everything would change. You'd start treating me differently. You'd see Dr. Francisco Rodriguez, the famous surgeon, instead of just Frank, the guy who helps kids get their shots." Lisa had to admit he had a point. Knowing what she knew now, it was hard not to think about Frank differently. She found herself remembering conversations they'd had and wondering if she'd said something foolish to someone so accomplished. "For the past month," Frank said, "I've been happier than I've been since Maria died. Working at the clinic, helping people, being useful. It felt like I was remembering who I used to be before I got so caught up in the business side of medicine." "You gave me that gift. You gave yourself that gift," Lisa said. "I just happened to be the person who was there that night." "But that's exactly my point," Frank said. "You were there. When it mattered, when someone needed help, you were there. That's the kind of person I want running the new center." Lisa's stomach fluttered. In all the shock of discovering Frank's identity, she'd almost forgotten about his announcement that she would be the director of the new facility. "About that," she said, "Frank, I can't accept that job. I mean, I'm honored that you'd even think of me, but I'm not qualified to run something that big." "Why not?" Frank asked. "Because I'm just an ER doctor. I've never managed anything bigger than a shift schedule. Running a whole medical center? That's way beyond my experience." Frank shook his head. "Lisa, do you know what the most important qualification is for running a place like this? It's not an MBA or years of administrative experience. It's understanding that every person who walks through those doors deserves the best care you can give them, regardless of whether they can pay for it. You understand that better than anyone I've ever met?" Lisa felt overwhelmed. "But the money, Frank, $15 million. That's an incredible responsibility." It is, Frank agreed. But I've watched you work. I've seen how you interact with patients, how you manage the chaos of a busy clinic, how you make everyone around you want to be better at their jobs. Those are the skills that matter. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fountain and watching hospital workers walk by on their way to and from shifts. Lisa thought about everything that had happened since that stormy night 6 weeks ago. How a simple decision to help a stranger had led to this moment, sitting in a garden talking about running a multi-million-dollar medical facility. "Can I ask you something?" Lisa said finally. "Of course. That night in the rain, were you really just wandering around or were you looking for something specific?" Frank considered this question carefully. "I was looking for a reason to keep going," he said honestly. "I'd been walking through the city for weeks trying to figure out if my life still had any purpose. I kept thinking about Maria, about how she always said that the best part of being a doctor was the chance to show up for people in their worst moments." He paused, smiling at the memory. That night, sitting in the rain, I was pretty much at my worst moment. And then you showed up. It felt like Maria was reminding me that there are still people in the world who show up for each other, even when it's not convenient, even when there's nothing in it for them. Lisa felt tears in her eyes. "So what happens now?" "Now," Frank said, "we build something amazing. The Maria Rodriguez Center for Community Health is going to be the best free clinic in the state. We're going to hire the best doctors and nurses. We're going to treat every patient with dignity and respect. And we're going to prove that high-quality health care shouldn't depend on how much money you have." Lisa looked at Frank, really looked at him. She could see the successful surgeon he had been, but she could also see the grieving widower who had lost his way. Most importantly, she could see the man who had found his purpose again by helping others. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll run your center. But I have one condition." Frank raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "You have to stay involved. Not as my boss, but as my partner. These people need both of us." Frank's face lit up with the biggest smile Lisa had seen from him yet. "Deal," he said, extending his hand for her to shake. As they walked back toward the hospital together, Lisa realized that sometimes the most important decisions you make happen in a split second. Sometimes you see someone who needs help and you stop. Sometimes that decision changes everything, not just for them, but for you too. The rain had brought them together, but it was their shared commitment to helping others that would keep them working side by side for years to come.